Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar in anticipation of the upcoming 2017 Research Impact Summit. I am Tamika Heiden, Principal of Knowledge Translation Australia, and today I am discussing the ins and outs of building research industry partnerships with James Dalton from GemMaker. So starting in 1999, James fulfilled various roles. He worked with Cochlear. He was which is the global expert in implantable hearing solutions. And he was doing a bunch of things there with being a principal engineer, senior surgical specialist, senior product marketing manager, and a product manager, and really working around that life cycle of the cochlear implant and the product line, developing a strategy to maximise the value of the company's professional relationships throughout the Asia Pacific region. James identified and connected with hundreds of potential Cochlear customers and collaborators to demonstrate the applications and the benefits of Cochlear products by a diverse means, including symposiums and study tours in locations including China and the US. So thank you, James, for joining me today. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Great to be here, Tamika.
So James, you've previously outlined in a few blogs that I've read the process of building partnerships through 5 steps. And today I'd really like to take the opportunity to discuss each of these elements and get you to share your experiences with our audience around some of these key elements, but also around the key learnings that you have from these experiences, which I think will be really valuable. We talk a lot in Australia about our poor rankings on collaboration and the gap between research and industry in particular. And there's indeed a lot to learn, and we often hear about how we need to change our culture around this. So can you talk us through what you've seen to work when you're developing up culture and practices that facilitate partnerships from your experience?
Yeah, sure. My experience was in the medical device field, and so I was working a lot with medical professionals. And in many cases, these people are entrepreneurial. They run their own medical practice. They may also have an academic position with an affiliated university, as well as having a relationship with the company through the use of the medical device. So these people are already well positioned to see a problem from a range of perspectives, and they usually have the interests of the end user at heart, which I think is a really important perspective. Now, not everyone, of course, is in the position of working with medical professionals, but they are a good model for the culture and practices that I think lead to productive partnerships. So what was it about this group that facilitated good partnership? I think it boils down to 3 things, really. I think they had a recognition that success has many parents, and so forming teams of capable people and looking for positive outcomes for all is an important characteristic of the main parties. So attitude plays a big part. Also, I think their behaviour has a great influence on the teams they lead. Secondly, I think a focus on the technology and its benefit rather than on personalities and politics is really important. I think engineers are usually pretty good at focusing on the technology, sometimes to the detriment of the project. And so I think the challenge is to facilitate consideration of the end user and the challenge that the technology may help solve. And the third thing, I think, is to maintain regular contact. So you really want to get to know your partners on a human level. You don't have to be best buddies, but it's important to understand people's motivations and develop a relationship based on trust and respect. I think it's harder to do by email or phone, and so spending some time together is really important. I think this also gives you the opportunity to understand expectations from the project, and then you should follow that up by behaving in a way that's consistent with your values. So I think you need to be a genuine person.
There's a lot of complex kind of topics and personalities that come into play there. But I love, ultimately considering the end user is really key, and that's what I, advocate for in translation in particular. And I like that, focusing on the technology. And yeah, engineers are like that sometimes to the detriment, and obviously sometimes they're not so great with the personal relationship kind of things. But you mentioned there that trust and understanding are obviously, the basis of those strong relationships. And although that sounds really easy and it sounds straightforward, we know that this is really difficult to develop trust. Can you give us your advice and maybe some recommendations for how you've seen trust or understanding built within these teams?
Yeah, I think listening is really important. Both sides of the partnership need to listen with an open mind to what the other side is saying. Listening informs understanding, which I think is the foundation for a successful partnership. None of this, of course, is rocket science, but it does get frequently missed. I think once you have that understanding, then even when there's a disagreement, it's more likely to be resolved when there's this foundation of honesty and understanding. But of course, words have to be backed with action. And so usually this means that the desire to work together should be backed up with a task, with a project that's well defined and supported by funding and other resources. The important thing here is to make promises sparingly but honour them blindly. I think it's good to have a friendship, but I think it's a professional relationship which requires a professional approach, which means holding each other accountable to funding, to schedules and to project scope. Let me give you an example. So I had a customer who was unhappy with some of the commercial decisions that had been made, which affected his practice, the profitability of his practice. And I listened to his concerns, but ultimately the business decision was necessary and we couldn't reverse it. But we obviously wanted to maintain a productive, positive relationship with this long-standing and loyal customer. And so as a medical professional, he's someone who's motivated to build his credibility and academic standing. His university had excellent research facilities, both in medical research and engineering, and he felt he could contribute to a partnership. So we had some ideas about a particular area of research in which we could collaborate, and this was developed into a scope of work, a budget and a schedule was agreed. Ultimately, this was a very successful partnership and helped rebuild the commercial relationship as well. It provided opportunities for published papers and was the basis for a continuing research relationship. So this was typical of the kind of situation where you can actually use the research collaboration to maintain a good relationship through all sorts of difficulties which you might not be directly involved in.
It is really valuable to maintain the relationship, even if it's not going to be purposeful for this particular thing going forward. Because I think we do tend to just say, oh, that's not important, so we won't worry about that. But you never know what the future holds, and I think that's one of the keys. And the other thing that I think that was really interesting that you mentioned there around building trust and understanding is that, the words must be based with action. And yeah, all of these things do sound really logical. And one of the things I do find is we do forget to consider where we're going. And people, particularly in research, when I work with a lot of researchers, they can't do that zooming out of the big picture of where they're heading, what's the value of what's happening, what's the value for each person involved. And I often think that's why we need a little bit more planning and structure around some of the relationships. I think people often just say, we've just got to build a relationship and collaborate. But I think there needs to be some serious planning that goes in with that. And I'd love to hear maybe your thoughts on that in terms of, do you think that, there really needs to be some documentation and some planning around some of those types of things to help with that trust and understanding, I guess?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think just to dive in with good intentions is not enough to ensure a successful relationship. You need to have some basic project management principles in place. I mentioned before about having the scope and the time and the budget all defined. I think a big benefit of having that in place is really around expectations and making sure that both parties know what they're going to get out of the relationship, what they're going to get out of the collaboration, who's responsible for what. Because so often good intentions are undermined by a misunderstanding on something that's so basic and could have been resolved way back at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Good intentions are an interesting topic that I've just been thinking about lately when I've had very good intentions to get up early in the morning and exercise. And I've got to tell you that good intentions is not enough when it's cold.
No.
So we'll move on. So often, when I am talking to researchers, I'm finding that they can be really risk averse, and the type of work that you're talking about are things where people do need to take risk, and engaging with people outside of academia can feel quite risky and uncomfortable. So what would you say to people who do want to bridge this divide, but how would they manage their risks in doing so? What's the advice that you would give there?
Well, I think there's sort of two parts to this answer. So maybe it's second guessing a little bit, but the biggest risk I think that particularly universities and academics are fearful of is the risk of losing their IP, or what they see as losing their IP. I suppose this risk, but also lots of other risks around the project, can be managed again by collaborating on developing a risk matrix. What's likely to happen, or what could happen in this project? What's the impact on both of us, and what's the mitigation? What are we going to do if that risk is realised? So I think having that discussion up front can save a lot of trouble down the track. I know that people don't necessarily want to put the time into that because it's a bit bureaucratic, and why do we need to worry about this stuff when we could be off doing the cool research? But I think a few hours spent on risk management like that can save a lot of trouble. A couple of things about IP though. I think in my experience, the biggest impediment to collaboration between industry and universities is intellectual property. I think what most often prevents good collaboration is a belief, and it's usually by universities, that IP is the sole yardstick by which they measure themselves. And that if they give it away through collaboration, they're surrendering their most valuable asset. But I think this is really a misguided point of view. I think if you're keen to hold onto your IP, and if you're keen, if you want to have lots of patents with your name on them, and that's more important than people benefiting from your brilliant scientific work, then yeah, collaboration is a risk. But I think you have to look at the bigger picture. Having intellectual property might be important in the academic sphere, but if you really want society to benefit from your work, you have to be prepared to give a little. And I think it's not so hard when you realise one important reality, which is this. Even in the best commercial hands, intellectual property is not a free ticket to massive profitability. There's a huge amount of work that's required to convert IP into profits. Many factors can prevent a good idea from becoming a commercial success, and navigating this is what an industrial partner can bring to the table. I suspect that that's not always recognised. Understanding this relationship and the dependence that each party has on the other, I think is really critically important to the translation of science into innovation. The best partnerships, and by best I mean the ones that result in benefit for both sides as well as a benefit to society, are those where this is well understood. I can think of an example actually where a tech transfer office was negotiating quite hard to extract from us payment for some patents that they had. And when I say us, I mean as the industrial partner in the collaboration. But in reality, the patents demonstrated that the team had the capability that we were looking for, and we wanted to work with them for that capability. But the patents themselves didn't really have a practical value. They were impractical to implement as they were written. So it's difficult to tell someone their baby's ugly. But effectively, that's what you're doing. You know, what you need to do is show them that you can turn that around, that your baby's ugly, but together we can transform it into something beautiful.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be using that line with someone with a newborn. But fantastic, yeah. So one of the other things I've heard about when it comes really to that risk sort of side of things, and I think you're spot on with the IP, but the other one that I've heard, and maybe you've got some thoughts on this as well, is that if you have industry funding, or if you're too involved with industry, that the results might be, you know, tainted. And there's this view of it being, you know, a bit of dirty research, if you like. And I think we've seen some examples of that, unfortunately, where things have happened that have sort of put a black mark across a lot of that type of work. And I am constantly questioned about, you know, if I get them involved, do I have to involve everyone in that industry? What if I just want one industry partner who sits in that industry? How's that work out for me? How's that look? Is it, you know, is it a bit dodgy?
Again, I think it comes down to expressing these expectations up front and having the discussion. So if you're concerned that IP that you have is going to become public domain and you'll lose it, or if you're concerned that that the research going forward is not going to be done in a way that, you know, that helps you develop the idea further, or develop whatever it might be in the way that it should be developed, then I think you need to have that up front. And you know, no industrial partner that's worth working for is going to ignore those concerns or disrespect them. If they did, then yes, I agree, you wouldn't want to work with them. But I think hopefully both sides come to the agreement with the desire to do something for the common good, but also for their mutual benefit.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's no guarantees, but you have to have that discussion.
Yeah. And I think that links a little bit back to trust. And so having the right agreements and discussions in place, absolutely. But it does, you know, kind of go back to trust that people will, you know, do what they say they will. And I think that's part of not jumping in too quickly and developing up those relationships and working out if they are people that you can work with.
Yeah. We had research, you know, we've had partners who said, look, it's really important to us to publish, and we want to publish the results of our collaboration. And yet, because of the product development timelines, we didn't want that information released in the public domain until the product was launched. And so we had to say, well, we realise that you want to publish. Can it be delayed to this time? Or can there be an embargo on it? Or, you know, we had to try and come to some sort of mutual arrangement. Because I think, and that's just an example of, you know, how you can talk these things through at the outset.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. I think our funding and reward mechanisms in Australia, which is something that constantly amazes me, again, play into that, because for researchers, they're rewarded on research papers and publications. And so for those researchers who are serious about making a difference and who do want to work with industry, but are measured by the yardstick of how many publications you have, it's a very fine balance and a difficult line to walk on. I did see the other day, really interestingly, I was reading an article and they mentioned that you need a prenup for collaboration.
Yes.
So I did like that, and I thought maybe that's something that we could, you know, get out there for researchers, a prenup for your collaboration.
That's pretty spot on, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think you need an exit strategy as well. But, you know, so we know that research, and we're talking about, you know, bridging that gap, and research is often this really individual process, and a lot of researchers work completely in silos. And we know that bridging this gap requires the trust that we've talked about. It requires that managing of risk that we've just talked about, but it also requires a lot of other skill sets if you're going to work in a team. Can you talk us through some of that side of bridging the gap, like who should be involved, how to get the best out of the team? What are some of those skill sets that people could, you know, brush up on or think about or look for in other team members to help with that process?
Yeah, I think in general, it's good for everyone in the team to have a broader view. So obviously they're expert in their specific area, and that's really where the core value is of the collaboration. But I think everyone needs to have a good understanding of what the research is for, who it's going to benefit, how it fits into the bigger picture. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think there's certainly a benefit to bringing others in, both from within the company and within the university, And I think there's three important points to make here. One is that by exposing the team to the end users, the beneficiaries of their work, I think that helps to provide context and demonstrates the value of what they're working on. They can see how their work makes a direct impact on their lives, and this was certainly the case at Cochlear. I mean, it was fairly easy to give them that insight there. When the opportunity was there, then we would take the researchers through the building, we'd show them the physical product, and we'd relate it to some stories of cochlear implant recipients. And that always made a big impact on them. You could feel that it energised the partnership. Secondly, I think involving the end user can provide a reality check, which can prevent over-engineering or gold plating. So it can help to identify features which will rarely be used, and then you can divert that effort into improving the essentials. I think this keeps the project team focused on solving really important problems, and it inviting participation from others from both organisations across a broad range of disciplines can tap into expertise that can help clear roadblocks outside of your direct area of expertise. So, and these people can become influential allies and advocates for the project. Also, I think involving more junior colleagues can free you up for other priorities and provides them with a great opportunity for professional development. Lastly, collaborative projects are an opportunity to rapidly expand your professional network. I think if you stay within the confidentiality terms of the agreement, it's another way to progress rapidly because you can use those contacts that you've made, or at least improve your odds of achieving a technical or scientific breakthrough.
So ultimately, just to summarise that a little bit, you're sort of saying, you know, you really want, as part of your team, you want some of those end users, you want to bring in some of your junior colleagues, build up their skill set, and also the key researchers as part of that team. With regard to perhaps the skill sets or things that people need to sort of have or to be aware of. I mean, obviously I've worked with a lot of researchers who I find need to improve their self-awareness in working with teams. Are there, when you're working particularly, I guess, at Cochlear, you were probably more around that sort of brokering kind of role, but was there any particular sort of training or skill set development that happened to help people really to integrate with industry, or was it really just a learn as you go kind of situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. We didn't do any specific training. Maybe, as I mentioned before, we were sort of fortunate in the type of people that we had collaborating. And I think also for some of the more, so a lot of the research that I was doing was quite practical. It was developing, an item, an apparatus, something like that. I think where there was collaboration in more areas of more basic research, the way that was managed was by internal research professionals within Cochlear. So they were effectively acting as the translation, if you like, from the researcher into the industrial partner. So probably they had skill sets that would allow that to happen, rather than trying to give the researcher those skill sets. But you're right, it's certainly the case that the better researchers, if you like, the ones that people like to work with, were the ones who had an appreciation for the company and what it was trying to achieve, and the fact that it had certain constraints on it, and that, the world didn't necessarily revolve around the research. The research is really important, but they wanted to see that research become a reality in a product.
Yeah.
And I think I don't quite know how you get that skill set into somebody, but there is a lot of self-awareness in there. There's a lot of awakening, that you need to look up from your lab from time to time and see that there's a bigger picture out there, and it doesn't make you any less important or your work any less valuable. But if to go to the next step, you want to get it out there. You want it to be in a product. You want to be talking about it at a conference.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, It's an interesting one. I've worked with many researchers. There are researchers who openly will admit that they just want to go into a lab and do research. They love research, and that is absolutely hats off to them. But what we're seeing, and this leads really nicely into my next question for you, is we are seeing this move towards impact. The Australian government is very interested in impact. I'm hosting an entire summit on impact because global funders are all looking around. How can we determine our return on investment from research, if you like? What is the impact of that? So when we're talking about engaging with industry, we're obviously increasing our opportunities to have an impact because we are delivering something that's relevant, wanted and needed, and a lot of the things that you've sort of said there around that context piece. Can you tell us a little bit about, if you did, and how you measure the impact of the partnership?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think there is an increased emphasis on impact and on measuring return on investment. In my case, I don't think we directly ever measured return on investment, and partly that's because in a product, if you like, there are many pieces that make up that product, many pieces of research done by lots of different researchers and lots of different institutions. And so it's really difficult to measure the contribution of one of them. I think that the measurements were mostly qualitative. So do we have a good relationship with these important partners? Because in our case too, in Cochlear's case, a lot of those partners, our research partners, were also our customers. You can hear my dog barking in the background.
Yes, I hope it's your dog, otherwise you're about to be attacked.
And so it was very important to make sure that people involved in research were happy and engaged, because they were also customers, wearing a slightly different hat. So I think, we would ask certain questions at the beginning of the collaboration. What do we aim to get out of this? What do our partners aim to get out of this? What's the information that we want as a result of this project, and how is that going to help us get to where we need to be? And so, and how much time have we got, and how much money are we going to spend, obviously. And so all those things are fairly easy to measure throughout the project and at the end. Did we get to where we wanted to get to? Did both parties meet their expectations for this collaboration? Have we preserved our relationships to the point where we want to work with them again in future? I guess they were the sort of measures that we were focused on.
And I think,
individual return on investment.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to sort of the impact of the partnership or the relationships, and knowing whether or not, I guess preserving the relationship. So one of the things, like you mentioned there, is purely, do they want to keep working with you? And I think that's a really good measure. But unfortunately, those types of measures wouldn't count for the way that we're counting impact. But I do think we shouldn't write them off as being not important. I guess, ultimately though, it was those relationships that led to having an impact by being able to deliver something in a product or some way to an end user. Without the relationships, it probably wouldn't have been as successful.
Certainly there were projects that had a fairly clear benefit that could be measured. So it was impacting something that we were perhaps already measuring, such as product reliability or infection rate or number of upgrade products sold, those sorts of things. You can see a direct relationship between a product feature or a benefit and an upclick in sales or an improvement in performance. I think it becomes more difficult when you've got to get into a lot of in-depth economic modelling around what's the impact to society by reducing this incidence of this disease, or allowing this person to work longer, or those sorts of things. Then it gets more complicated. But of course, in a regulated environment where you're also seeking to get reimbursement a lot of that information has to be developed anyway. So probably medical devices are a little ahead of the curve for some research projects than others.
Yeah, and I mean, really, that's stretching down the line to those longer term big impacts.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing to be really clear about, is there's those short term impacts of change in something that we see straight away, like those smaller ones that you mentioned, versus those long term big economic and social benefits, which take a long time to measure and take a long time to happen. And then there's a lot of problems around attribution and how much was it that whatever you did, attributed to that. And so yes, very interesting. What I might do now is open up for questions. I'll just get Jonathan back. And Jonathan, thank you for joining us and listening. Do you have any questions? You can unmute your microphone if you have any questions for James.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, James. Thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. Look, I'm in a different area. My people here are, kind of artists and designers and stuff. But I think there's a lot of common ground in this. We're all trying to get out and work with people outside the university. You're trying to work with people inside the university. And I just sat in a meeting this morning where a whole bunch of people like that were talking about impact and trying to work out what impact meant for them. Right? I absolutely love the stuff around trust and respect and being able to just have like an honest conversation with someone around a problem to do with a project. And if you don't have that, if you can't have that conversation because there's some sort of barrier in the way, then you're never going to get to the point where you can just run a project cleanly. But it does strike me that sometimes the barriers in the way to that are other parts of your organization who are all also trying to help, right? But there's a great paper that I read recently that talks about it in a hospital setting where it's like, they're saying, oh, we've got the nurses and we've got, clinical practitioners and we've got specialist practitioners and whatever. They all see the evidence of this particular change, but and they're all working towards the same end in the hospital, but they've got different worlds and different world views. And I was just wondering how you cope with that, because Cochlear, I imagine, like it's a reasonable company, but it's got one clear aim. Whereas, the organisational strategy of most universities is, be a bigger university. And there's like, you're dealing with, you've got legal, you've got, research office, you've got the researchers themselves. How does that play out in this kind of, when you're trying to build this sort of relationship? Because it can be tricky, I imagine.
Yeah, look, it's probably some people listening to what I've said would think that's a lot of hooey because it's it's too simplistic or too idealistic, and that's true. It's rarely as simple as you develop a good relationship and off we go happily into the sunset.
Right.
You have other competing interests. You have accountants and you have administration and you have all sorts of people, just as you say, all trying to help, but they're actually getting in the way. And there's unfortunately, I don't have the comprehensive answer to solve that. But I guess it's part of it is trying to understand what you need to do to convince those people of the benefit or of the outcome. Is it in the way that you present the information to them, in the way that you tailor the message to address their concern? Or so if they want to make it a bigger university, how can you tell them that this collaboration is going to result in a bigger university, or we need to be working with this group because they're the leading industry group in the world, or what does it do for the university's reputation? So I guess the point of what I'm saying is it's not just about the research or the technology or the product or the discipline that you're focused on. It's what's the bigger picture? How does what you're doing contribute to that goal that those other people are trying to achieve? Yeah, that's not always easy to do, but that's the best I can offer.
You good? Unmute. There you go. I also liked what you said about, you know, at Cochlear, you didn't necessarily try and measure impact because it's hard to measure the contribution of any given researcher or research group. Whereas the impact agenda at universities is it's really odd. It's being pushed around what research did your group do and where did it lead? And it's not, when you think about impact, that's not the way you think about impact at all. You're thinking about, you know, well, how many people can hear on the basis of the work that we've done? And it's a broad view. It's not a question, it's more a comment, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. It's another great example of putting a contrived framework around something that doesn't operate like that. You know, it reminds me of the way that accountants have to manage their task by putting dates around things and financial years and financial months, and you know, it doesn't always work like that, right? As we well know. But it's, I guess, from looking at it from their perspective, they have to come up with a way of measuring, of accounting. No one's come up with a better system yet. And so it's probably a similar thing in a university where you have to try and apportion value to different functions of the university. And it's an imperfect process because in some cases it's quite intangible, you know, but how do you get a handle on that?
Yeah.
We're not there yet.
No, we are absolutely not there yet. The other thing is you essentially, when you gave examples, you generally gave examples of successful collaborations, and that's fair enough. When it's all gone south, from your point of view, what's the best way to step away?
That's a really good question. We did have an example, or a few examples, but one I can think of where, and I would have done this probably differently in hindsight, but we had a collaboration with the university, and we weren't sure that the product that they, you know, the idea they had was actually of practical value, but we said let's develop a prototype, and we'll do a laboratory experiment which simulates reality and see how it goes. Of course, when we did that, a lot of our concerns were realised that, you know, it wasn't very practical. This was in an operating theatre environment. It was difficult to use. It probably made the surgery slower and more, probably introduced new risks, and so it just wasn't going to fly, you know. And I think that was important for them to see for themselves that this has severe limitations. And it's like I was saying before, you know, when you've invented it yourself, you don't really want to listen to people who say this is not going to work, you know, but you can show them it's not going to work. Might be a more expensive way to do it, but you kind of want to allow them to save face, you know, come and see that it doesn't work, and then we'll give you the opportunity to go away and fix it. And in that particular example, they sort of went away and lost a bit of interest because I think they thought, I don't think there's a way of fixing this, you know. So it just sort of fizzled out, but not necessarily the best way to do it, but that was a good example.
But it's, I mean, like you said, it's an expensive way to do it, but essentially what you did was a little trial, a little prototyping.
Yeah, exactly.
If you jumped in first, and it would have been much worse.
Yes, and we tried to do it at an early stage too, so that we didn't spend a huge amount of money taking it further down the path before coming to this point. Yeah. So maybe we save money in the long run.
So I guess another question from my point of view. One of the things that came up in this meeting I was in today was about people saying, "Oh, look, we need to fix the broken aspects of the university. You know, contracting is too slow and legal is too onerous and da 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 da." When you work with universities, with research organisations, how much does that stuff matter? Like you've got, for example, you've got a researcher or a research group that you clearly want to work with, if the administration behind that is just too hard, what happens? Or, you know, is it just, well, we'll carry that pain to a certain level because we can see the value of the research? I don't know.
I think it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question, because
Sure.
it depends on what stage the research is at. So is this basic research, or is this applied research? If it's applied research and we need that information for a product that we're going to launch in 12 months' time, well, then it matters a lot, right? Because if you're dragging the chain, it's not going to happen in time. You know, you have to be very disciplined. If it's basic research, then perhaps it's not quite as critical.
Sure.
But no one benefits from having a slow bureaucracy.
No.
You know, particularly if it's holding up funding or it's holding up release of resources, or because of that dependency I mentioned, there's each party has an effect on the other. So if the university's slow, it's going to be draining resources in the company when they could be doing something else or working with somebody else, and possibly vice versa.
Yeah.
So I think it matters. I think if it comes back to what I said about backing your words with actions. You know, if you're serious about innovating and collaborating, and you've got to look at your processes and see if you can improve them.
Yeah.
Be responsive.
Yes, it's in a big organisation. Unfortunately, particularly an organisation that's not necessarily profit driven. Unfortunately, you give someone a job to do, and they focus on doing that job. So they're not necessarily interested in improving their processes so you can benefit.
That's right.
They're interested in doing the job they think they have to do. And you know, kind of fair enough. It comes back to that whole idea of different parts of the organisation all trying to work together, but having different world views. So,
it's a silo thing, isn't it, really? You need to get people out of the silo saying, look, together team, we're trying to achieve this. What can we do to get there? You know, forget about, you can't say forget about it, but, you know, it's very hard to unwrap people's hands off their domain and think about it, you know. And as you mentioned before, that's largely due to the way they're measured. And so I think it comes down to having a good university leadership who understand the many moving parts and trying to get them all to sort of be pulling in the right direction, if I can mix a metaphor or two.
Yep.
I think, you know, and it is important that we think about how they navigate that. It's a really good point, Jonathan, around the movement being too slow. And I think one of the things that I've really seen is that firstly, we don't know how to navigate it. So researchers themselves aren't taught what's the timelines for some of these processes. So you've got someone like me saying, yep, go work with end users, build relationships. And then they realise that the legalities of that and the things they have to jump through, the hoops they have to go through to actually get that to go, you know, they can't do that in time for granting and for grant writing. And I think that's one of the big ones. But we did see a lot of changes across many organisations in ethics, where they've reduced down ethics timelines, they've reduced down the number of pages that are needed to, like, you know, a 2-page kind of document. So there's some options there, I think, if we can start to get these other areas of the university to start to think a bit more smartly.
And it's a good point. When early on, I think it was, I can't remember, someone talked about working with multiple partners, and I thought there's a role sometimes for peak bodies where they can be a neutral kind of body, and you know, for every aspect of the university there's some little group that sits above them that goes, we try to do best practice, you know. So the ethics people have a really good worldwide network of university ethics people who have spearheaded that, and all you need is someone who goes, actually, you know, the benchmark for legal processing of a contract is blah. Let's try and better that, you know. And all of a sudden you're going in the right direction. Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point.
Yeah, I think, but it's really about getting those other areas of the university to work in that way, and that's not always easy. Well, thank you, James. Thanks for joining, Jonathan. Great questions. And James, thank you very much for your time today. And it's been really interesting. I know that this is a topic that is close to a lot of people's interest and hearts, if you like, particularly given the path we're going down. Obviously, with a product, it's always going to be different to just knowledge. But I think that the principles are the same around that respect and trust and how we manage those relationships and the skill sets we need and how we work in teams. All of those things are the same. So thank you so much for your time and for joining today.